So while y'all finish with getting snacks and drinks, I'm going to get started with the introduction to our speaker today. In case you don't know me, my name is Kimberly Hill. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Civil, Environmental, and Geoengineering in the Water Resources Group. It's my pleasure to be introducing Professor Peter Nelson from Colorado State University. I've known Peter for quite a while, sort of intermittently, I would say. He visited SAFL back in the summer of about 2006 when he was here for a sort of one of these great early career summer research experimental programs that was run by some of our faculty like Chris Paola and a few other people. And we have then crossed paths again when he was doing research for his graduate school. So I should now just make sure that I am getting the years right. So Peter graduated from Princeton University, where he did some research with Professor Smith there on urban hydrology, did a year off to do research there to further sort of an assistantship. And then he pursued, that was in the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department at Princeton. Then he went on to search out the research plan and the professor that he really thought would be a great guide to what he was particularly interested in, river morphology. And of course there are a handful, but I mentioned this because it's a very good friend of the lab, Professor Bill Dietrich at UC Berkeley. So Professor Nelson pursued his PhD with Bill Dietrich at Berkeley on things that some of which he'll touch on and related to current research, but the one that caught my eye when I was visiting Bill was his work on bimodal mixtures in sand and gravel, and the type of mobilization that you can get there, and the unique sort of sorting and things like that. So after that, he received one of the prestigious international NSF postdocs and went to work with Professor Giovanni Seminara in Italy, working on an analytical model for this, which is incredibly complex and also very elegant and interesting. And then after that, he returned to Colorado State University, where he has been since. He received a teaching award, a best teaching award. He was, the chair of, the Borland Chair of Hydraulics for several years, and just recently was promoted to full professor. And he's done, I want to step aside very quickly, but I first want to point out he's going to talk a lot about his gravel bed river morphodynamics work in the field and in modeling. But another interesting aspect of his work that I know a number of people are interested in at this lab has to do with post wildfire burn morphology. So if you don't have enough questions for him, that is yet another aspect of his work that is particularly fascinating and touches on sediment transport work, but really I feel like Peter is at the cutting edge of that work, and that part is fascinating. But he's going to talk about another part of our research world that he is at the cutting edge of, and that is on gravel bed river morphodynamics in response to changing flow and supply. So without further ado, let's welcome our seminar speaker for today.
Thanks, Kimberly, and thanks everyone here and online for coming. It's really an honor to be invited here. I've enjoyed my time today talking to everybody and seeing the lab, and as Kimberly mentioned, I was last here like 19 years ago, so it's bringing back fond memories of some very hard work that was done over the course of an abbreviated period of time. And what I'm going to talk about today is actually kind of related to what I was doing way back then, because we're trying to understand how river channels change, especially gravel bed river channels, how they change in in response to some kind of disturbance. And so when I talk about disturbance in fluvial systems, this is what I tend to think about, something that will affect the amount of water and or sediment that's coming into a river network or a stream. So this might be things like urbanization. These are all photos from Colorado. So Denver, urbanization, changing the hydrology and runoff, and sediment coming into urban stream channels. How do they respond to these disturbances? Dams, clearly, are a big disturbance to fluvial systems, both the installation, construction, and removal of dams. This has motivated a lot of the work that I've been doing over the past decade or so. And wildfire, as Kimberly mentioned, I've been active in trying to understand the effects of wildfire on the environment. And all of these things can change the amount of water and sediment coming into a stream. That stream is going to adapt somehow to that, and some of the research that I'm going to talk about is going to get at what we're learning about how that works. This is becoming increasingly relevant, I would argue, for the United States and around the world. Dam removals in particular are becoming quite more frequent as dams need to be either recommissioned or decommissioned. They're increasingly being removed as a form of river restoration. So trying to understand what happens to this big slug of sediment that's been built up behind a dam over the last several decades as it moves downstream is one thing that's motivating some of the research that I'll talk about today. Similarly, wildfires can lead to debris flows and other forms of erosion that import a lot of sediment into stream channels. That sediment goes somewhere. What does it do to the morphology of the channel? Wildfires are becoming increasingly frequent. Things like climate change and historic fire suppression over the past 100 years have led to larger, hotter wildfires that then lead to greater amounts of sediment coming into stream channels. How do the streams respond to this sediment once it gets in there? There are different approaches that people can take to try to address these questions. You might have seen a figure like this on the left. This scale is known as Lane's balance, or the Lane-Borland balance. This is a version of it that was put together by Dustin Wool in 2012. But the idea is that we have some sort of balance between sediment grain size, sediment supply, water discharge, and slope, that when one of those things comes out of balance, the other things need to kind of compensate or adjust. If you like to think in terms of equations, which I oftentimes do, this is the only equation I have in my talk today, but it's an important one. It's the Exner equation, which describes how the change in elevation of the bed of a river, the elevation with respect to time, is going to respond to a divergence in sediment flux. So if we have more sediment coming into a place that's going to, than is going out, it's going to erode. If there's more going out than coming in, it's going to erode. We can plug this into a numerical model of some whatever level of complexity we're working with, and we can try to make predictions about how streams will respond to something that might affect that sediment flux coming in. Experimentally, there are ways to look at these as well. I'm going to focus on experiments today. We're at SAFL. We probably know something about doing experiments to understand the fundamental mechanisms underlying natural processes. And what I want to highlight over the next couple of slides are just different scales of response that rivers have shown to changing sediment supply, starting from kind of the smallest scale leading up to larger scales. And at what I would call the patch scale, this is work that I did when I was a graduate student, we were looking at how the heterogeneity and sorting of the surface of the bed can change with changing sediment supply, and did some experiments both at Berkeley and here at SAFL where we documented the sorting and showed how the sorting becomes less pronounced as you have lower sediment supply, or if you increase the sediment supply, you get more heterogeneous sorting patches. As we move up beyond the patch scale to like the riffle pool scale, we tend to get pool filling. This isn't flume data, so I misspoke. This is a conceptual diagram from field work that Tom Lyle and others did, showing that we can potentially use the amount of fine sediment that gets deposited in pools of gravel bed channels as a proxy for sediment supply, which can be important in places like coastal California. This might look familiar. This is Susanna Irwin's work that she did at the Outdoor Stream Lab, looking at how a bar in a bend changes its morphology in response to an increase in sediment supply. So it started with a low feed aggradational case, increased the sediment supply significantly, and then brought it back down to a degradational case. And she documented how the bar that had formed in this Outdoor Stream Lab channel aggraded during the aggradational high feed case and then degraded back down. So trying to make connections between the sediment supply and the bar morphology in this relatively well-controlled experimental outdoor situation. This is similar work that was done indoors by Eaton and Church in 2009, where they also changed the sediment supply into an inset experimental meandering channel. And their main finding with this work was that if they doubled the sediment supply, they mainly only saw surface grain size adjustment. They didn't really see slope changes. They didn't see changes in the bar pool morphology. The bar amplitude is largely a sorting phenomenon up to some threshold, at which point the whole thing started to aggrade. Okay, so there are different scales. We've seen changes in the sorting with the patches. We've seen pools filling in or not. We've seen changes in the surface grain size. We've seen changes in the bar morphology. There's all these things that the stream can do to accommodate changes in sediment transport or sediment supply. And how do we make sense of what's going to happen when and where? This is a question that John Buffington asked in 2012, and he put together this kind of nice conceptual diagram looking at the spatial scale of response versus time of how rivers might be able to adapt to some sort of disturbance in sediment supply, where we have ranging from the grain size scale all the way up to an overall change in the stream gradient or the slope. There's kind of a range of spatial scales over which things can happen, and associated with that is the temporal scale over which that might also happen, where smaller grain size changes can happen much more quickly than a large scale change in the overall stream slope. So this is going to be a motivator for what I'm going to talk about next, which are the experiments that we did. We wanted to try to start to be able to answer questions like, what are the relative magnitudes of these changes? Do they happen simultaneously or in sequence? Are they persistent or transient? And how might they depend upon the channel width or the planform? Okay, so with that as some background, I'm going to spend the majority of this talk talking about 3 flume experiments that we did at the hydraulics laboratory that we have at Colorado State University. And these are schematics of the 3 experimental setups that we used to try to get at these questions, going from essentially simple to more complicated. So we started with a straight constant width flume. We then imposed downstream variations in width, sinusoidal variations in width. And then we kept a constant width, but we made the channel a meandering planform. These are all fixed wall experiments, so we don't have any bank erosion in these. That's a limitation to the experiments, but it's what we were able to do for these particular projects. And these were done by graduate students who were working with me at the time. The top 2 straight channel experiments were part of Jacob Morgan's PhD thesis, and then this meandering channel was David Cortez's master's experiment. So they really get all the credit. This gives you an idea of what we would do during these experiments. This is the flume. So this is just a tiny part of our hydraulics lab at CSU. Time-lapse photo. We have a measurement cart, which I'll talk a little bit more about. But we would run water and sediment through from the upstream end. This is a sediment feeder. The upstream end with a structure for motion target taped onto it there. Water comes in through an upstream inlet. It's pumped from a sump under the floor in this case. And then downstream, which we can't see, there's a tail box that collects the sediment that comes out the downstream end of the flume and allows us to adjust the water surface elevation of the downstream end of the flume. So we built a cart that was inspired by the carts that you have here at SAFL. So we have everything computer controlled, 5 ultrasonic water level sensors that would measure the water surface when we have flow moving through the channel. For the topography, we would use structure from motion photogrammetry, which is something we've spent a lot of time developing techniques for in the lab at CSU. Jacob wrote a paper about it where we published this video with the paper, which the main thing I want to show is, besides it being kind of cool, is this, each of these large, going from 0.02 to 0.03, that's 1 centimeter of a cross section. And so depending upon how far away the camera is from the bed, we can get many points in the vertical on the essentially sub-millimeter scale. We can get individual grains if we set things up correctly to use structure from motion to get both topography and potentially grain size. So we've been using this in our experiments to measure the topography. And all 3, let's say this, the first 2 experiments followed the phases that I describe here. So there's 3 phases for each geometry meaning either straight constant width or straight variable width. And for both of these geometries, the first phase involved just imposing steady flow and steady sediment supply, establishing kind of baseline conditions. And then we wanted to know what happens if we impose a stepped repeated hydrograph, but we keep the same steady sediment supply. So we would impose this stepped hydrograph that was repeated in these kind of, I think these are 10-minute chunks, where we'd increase or decrease the discharge. And then we would establish an equilibrium condition there, keep the repeated hydrographs, but then double the sediment supply and see how the channel responds. So by going from phase 1 to phase 2, we can assess what is unsteady flow due to the system. And by going from phase 2 to phase 3, we can assess how does that system then change in response to an increase in sediment supply. And we can do that for both the constant width and the variable width channel to try to understand what width variations do to these systems. So our objectives here were to quantify how is the channel morphology in constant and variable width flumes going to adjust to those impositions of hydrographs and then the increase in sediment supply. And our ideas coming into this were that we would see more sorting response. We would see potentially larger variation in fine and coarse parts of the surface in this variable width channel. And we would mainly see a large slope increase in the constant width channel, but the variable width channel would likely have bed forms that might adjust their dimensions in response to this sediment supply increase. Those were our ideas coming in. I like to talk about scaling briefly when I introduce experiments like this, because that's always a question that reviewers in particular have. So if we follow the Froude scaling that I think Gary Parker did a really nice job describing in this 2003 paper on floodwater extraction and mountain stream morphology, we can use something like, I have it on here somewhere. Is there a scaling factor? There's a scaling factor someplace that I'm not seeing. We can use a scaling factor, and if we apply that to this geometry and this sediment and this discharge, we can scale up to a channel that's about 35 meters wide with a D50 of like 136 millimeters and approximately a 13-hour hydrograph, which, being on the banks of the Mississippi sounds pretty small still, but for like a gravel bed stream in Colorado is pretty reasonable. Okay, so that's sort of sets the conditions for what we were doing. I'm going to show figures like this for a few slides, but this is essentially all of the results of the first geometry experiment. And I'll try and describe how to read this. So on the left, we've got FO1, PO1. This means flume 1, phase 1. FO1PO2 is flume 2, phase 2. This is where we imposed this repeated hydrograph. And then FO1P3 is phase 3, where we doubled the sediment feed and kept the same repeating hydrograph. And as we go down from top to bottom, there are different variables that were measured throughout the course of the experiment. So we start with water discharge. We've got the sediment coming in and out of the flume. We've got the grain diameter. This is essentially the D84, the D50, or the D16 of the surface. We have the water surface slope or the bed surface slope. We've got the flow depth, aspect ratio, which is width to depth ratio, boundary shear stress, averaged over the flume, and the Froude number. So what do I want to point out here for this first experiment? Did you have a question?
Very quick question, I'll use the microphone. But the jiggle of the discharge, can you just like translate that to sort of what is the time per wavelength, or what's the frequency of changing?
Sure, yeah, so this is time in minutes on the bottom, and it's this hydrograph, right? So it goes from, it's 2 hours for a complete, say, wavelength of our hydrograph. All right, so I'm not sure exactly how many of these there are, but these experiments took a long time. Okay, so the main response here, you can see a lot of these, there's just not a lot of change, especially if we're focused on either from phase 1 to phase 2 or phase 2 to phase 3. If we go from phase 1 to phase 2, where we have repeat hydrographs, the depth and the slope were largely unchanged by that. When we increased the sediment supply, we went from phase 2 to phase 3, the main change in the channel was an increase in the slope. Right? We can see this jump up in the bed and the water surface slope, but everything else except for the shear stress, which went up because the slope increased, was largely unchanged. The bed load grain size remained largely constant for all of the phases, so is mainly a slope response for this first straight channel. Okay, so that should be in the back of our minds when we talk about what happens in the next channel. But before I get there, I want to point out some things that we saw in the flume during this experiment, which was these bed forms that emerged. And you can sort of see, this is as the flume was draining, we took a picture, and you can see this low flow channel, and it looks like alternate bars. Right? We developed these bar-like features. This is a detrended DEM with, if we take the right side of the flume average elevation, the left side of the flume average elevation, subtract one from the other, we can quantify the amplitude and the wavelength of these bed forms through this so-called zero crossing method. And we can also track for the various structure for motion scans that we did of the bed, the heads of these bars, and get their celerity through time, their speed. And if we look at what happens to the bed form wavelength, the amplitude, and the celerity, going from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3, a few things emerge here. First of all, when we go from steady to unsteady flow, the biggest change is that the celerity drops way down, and the amplitude of those bed forms tends to kind of track with the discharge. So as the discharge goes up, the bed forms get taller. As the discharge goes down, they get smaller, and the overall speed declines. Then when we double the sediment supply, the speed goes up a little bit, but the amplitude sort of still more or less tracks with the discharge. So this raised some questions. Why do we think that this is happening? Why is the celerity, the speed of these things go down? My suspicion is that it has something to do with the nonlinear relationship between flow and sediment transport. In other words, when we have low flows, lower than the average flow during phase 1, everything basically stops or slows way down because you move much less sediment at a lower shear stress, and so that kind of dominates that celerity signal. And then during high flow periods, rather than moving faster, these things get taller. But then we also were confused about why these things formed in the first place, because our width to depth ratio during these experiments was about 8. And if you've ever tried to make alternate bars in the lab, or if you've talked to people who talk about alternate bars, they'll generally say that you need a much larger width-to-depth ratio than 8 to get alternate bars. You need something that's pretty shallow and pretty wide. This has been borne out through the Italian-style stability analyses that have done perturbations of the bed and tried to see under what conditions will you expect those perturbations to grow and form alternate bars. This is a Dave Furbish version of one of those that I plugged our numbers into, and it would suggest that we need a width-to-depth ratio of at least 15 to get bars for our conditions, but we had a width-to-depth ratio of 8. So we're not the only people to have seen alternate bar-like results for low width-to-depth ratios. These are some examples from other experiments in the literature with width-to-depth ratios below 10 that have seen something kind of similar. So to me, this suggests that maybe for these types of conditions and for our type of conditions, you need something more complicated than the underlying assumptions of some of these stability analyses. Maybe you need a fully three-dimensional hydrodynamic model as opposed to a depth averaged. I'm not sure. I haven't pursued that too much further. But nonetheless, we got these bar-like features that theory would not have predicted, say the dominant theory would not have predicted we would have seen. Okay, so to summarize this phase 1 experiment, straight channel, constant width, the main response was this slope increase to the increased sediment supply. When we had unsteady flow, that affected mainly the bed forms, but it didn't really affect anything else too much. The bed form geometry was largely unaffected by increased sediment supply, and theory would not have predicted those features. Okay, so a few things that we expected and a few surprises emerged from this first set of experiments. Okay, we can then move on to this second geometry. This is the same flume, but now we have put in these, I think it's maybe acrylic and wood sidewalls. So the average width of this channel is the same as the width of the straight channel with constant width. But now we have these portions that are wider than that average and these narrow parts that are narrower than that average. And they vary in a sinusoidal pattern down the channel. And this is motivated by trying to understand riffle pool features in the real world that are forced by variations in channel width in the downstream direction. So the idea here is that you have narrow parts of a channel, maybe it's bedrock confined or something that's causing channel narrowing and widening in the downstream direction. And where it gets narrow, you tend to have pools, and where it's wider, you tend to have shallower riffle areas. We started this work shortly after the removal of the Elwha and Glines Canyon dams on the Elwha River in Washington State. This, at the time, was the largest dam removal by sediment volume in history. And one interesting thing that they observed in that dam removal project was downstream of Glines Canyon Dam, as, I forget the number, something like some number of dozens of millions of tons of sediment, let's say. It's moving down the channel. There were downstream variations in the bankful width that prior to that sediment slug getting through corresponded to narrow width areas having pools, wide areas having riffles, narrow width having pool, wide having riffle. And then as the sediment got to that reach of the channel that had been stored behind Glines Canyon Dam, this pulse of sediment moving downstream, the pools filled in, and it became almost a plain bed type of morphology. But then a couple of months later, that pulse had moved through, and the pools came back to where they were. So they're still being forced by this downstream variation in width, and they temporarily filled in as the channel was accommodating this big pulse of sediment. So we thought, that's cool. You know, maybe we can try to replicate that in the lab and try to understand what is it about increasing sediment supply in this variable width channel that leads to this type of response. And can we then compare it to a case where we don't have this downstream width variation? So we did the same experiment that I described before, only with this new channel geometry. And this time we were trying to ask how does the riffle pool morphology that we expected to develop associated with these downstream changes in width, how does that respond to changes in and going from steady to unsteady flow and from one sediment supply to something that's higher. And again, these are our hypotheses from before. We expected more sorting in the variable width channel, and we expected more slope change in the straight constant width channel. All right, so topographically, this is what we saw. So this is a comparison between the constant width and the variable width channel. And you can see this is a detrended topography. These really bright colors in the middle show that it is shallower. It's kind of bumped up. In the literature, they call these things central bars. So it formed essentially a mound of sediment in the middle of these wider sections. There were central bars. And we had central bars for both the first, second, and third phases of the experiment, but their morphology changed somewhat, which I'll try to describe. Here's a photo showing what they look like as the flume is draining during one of the phases. And here on the left is the same figure that I showed you before from the constant width channel. And now on the right, we have the analogous measurements for the variable width channel. Again, it's these three phases, constant flow, constant sediment supply, repeated hydrographs, constant sediment supply, repeated hydrographs, doubled sediment supply. And we see the increase in sediment supply here being accommodated by this channel. But now, the slope response for this variable width channel is relatively muted, especially compared to the constant width channel. Right? The constant width channel, we see this distinct step up in the slope when we doubled the sediment supply. We don't see that same distinct step up. It goes up a little bit in this variable width channel, but definitely not as much. So something else is happening that's allowing this channel to pass twice the amount of sediment as it was before we increased that sediment supply. But it's not just a slope change. So there's a number of things that were going on here that we observed. One is that the lateral elevation variation declined when we increased the sediment supply. And so what I mean by that is if I took a cross section across a part of this channel, if I have a central bar, it's going from low to high in the middle. If I'm looking in a pool, it's maybe going from high to low in the pool. I can take all of those elevation measurements and calculate the standard deviation of them. And then I can plot that as distance downstream. And that gives me some idea of what's the sort of how flat versus how bumpy is the cross-sectional topography as I go downstream in my channel. And during the first two phases, we had, especially in these wider sections where we had those central bars, we had pretty significant standard deviation of cross-section elevations. We had pretty big differences as I went across the channel. But then when I look at the third phase where we doubled the sediment supply, that falls way off. It becomes much less variable in the cross-stream elevation, meaning that these big bumps in the middle of the channel sort of smooth themselves out. Okay? So we've smoothed out the lateral variation in the topography when we increase the sediment supply. We also can look at the bar pool relief, so the difference in elevation between the bar tops and the adjacent pools. And going from phase 1 to phase 2, there wasn't much of a change with that. But then from phase 2 to phase 3, when we doubled the sediment supply, the bar pool relief really takes a step down. It becomes less relief, less of a change in the elevation from bar tops to pools. So we have a combination of a smoothing out of the lateral topography and essentially a smoothing out of the longitudinal variation topography represented by bar pool relief when we doubled the sediment supply. And so we were able to essentially reduce the overall roughness of the system by smoothing out those topographic variations that had developed themselves during the first two phases of the experiment. And we didn't need to have a large slope change to be able to move a lot more sediment than we were beforehand.
Are the error bars the lateral variations?
Yeah, so these error bars here, they're not really error bars, they're just the variability in...
Like the
the measurement.
That you plotted in the previous slide.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so we have for each time we have a distribution of bar pool reliefs, and so this is showing kind of the central tendency and then the range that we got. So the bars and the pools are essentially changing their morphology in response to the increase in sediment supply. They're not changing them uniformly either. So if we look at the bars versus the pools, they both aggrade when we increase the sediment supply, but the pools aggrade more. Okay, so this is kind of analogous to the Lyle and Hilton thing that I showed at the beginning, where they look at the amount of fine sediment in pools as a proxy for sediment supply. That's kind of playing out in our experiments as well, where we have more pools filling in with sediment relative to the amount that the bars are grading as we doubled that sediment supply for this variable width channel. We can also look at how these bars and pools respond to individual hydrographs to try and get at some of that variability that's built into those error bars that I was showing. And so this plot is showing the mean elevation change for the second and third phase for bars and pools separated out. And this is during the course of a hydrograph. So just a single hydrograph during each of these phases. And we see that most of the variability is accommodated by the pools. We see greater pool relief over the course of the hydrograph. So one long-standing question in fluvial geomorphology, going back many decades, at least 50 years, has been, how do bars and pools persist, right? Why wouldn't we just expect pools to fill in and riffles to sort of erode? And what is the mechanism that allows these things to persist? Do we need to have unsteady flow? Do we need to have what's called flow convergence routing? Do we need to have like some sort of concentration and dispersion of discharge? And I think that what these results are showing with the individual hydrograph for both of these phases of the experiment is that with most of the change happening in the pool, we need to be able to have pool scouring during high flows and lower riffle building in order for these features to persist. So this is kind of potentially something that might be relevant for like managers who, in the American West at least, are trying to come up with maybe dam releases to try to maintain habitat. If they want to have pools and riffles persist for different types of aquatic habitat, then designing something in a way that will allow the pool to have greater change than the riffles is potentially a way to think about designing those things. All right, so to summarize the second channel geometry, we have the variable width channel, and it largely responded to the supply increase, sediment supply increase, by reducing its cross-sectional topographic variability, reducing the bar pool relief, essentially smoothing out the channel. We still have bars and pools there, riffles and pools, but less so than we did before we increased the sediment supply. So it didn't need to increase its slope dramatically in order to move twice as much sediment as it was beforehand. So we have kind of this extra set of degrees of freedom that the channel is able to adjust to accommodate this disturbance or this change that we've imposed externally. There are these interesting variations in bar pool relief that scale with the unsteady flow, and we saw more of that happening in the pools than on the bars. Okay, I'm going to take a sip of this because my throat is getting dry. Yeah, go ahead.
So, is it still representative, the fixed longitudinal slope for the case of width variation, or you see a kind of a variation in slope along the channel?
Oh, good question. So the question, if you're online, was is this downstream slope fixed? And I think I just have a single dot here. Yeah. So the data that I'm showing here are the average slope for the whole channel, but We didn't break that down into sort of sub-reach scale slopes. I suppose we might be able to back out kind of what it looked like from the bar pool relief, but I would have to go back to the data. Yeah, but I think because the bar pool relief, or bar pool relief, because that goes down with the increased sediment supply in that third phase, then almost by default, you would have to expect the slope from one pool to the next, that riffle slope, to have declined, I would guess. But we could look at it in more detail. Okay. So now moving on to this last geometry, this meandering geometry. This again is the same flume, but now, because we're trying to fit 4 bends inside that flume, we've scaled things down pretty significantly from a width and a grain size perspective. In this case, what we wanted to do was try to understand, how does a channel that has this series of bends in it respond to changes in sediment supply? And importantly for this one, what is the temporal progression of the scale of response in meandering channels? In other words, we don't want to just have equilibrium 1 and equilibrium 2 and compare them, but we want to document everything going from the first equilibrium to the second and see if there is some sort of sequence that the system is following as it responds to an increase in sediment supply. Are they happening one after the other, consecutively, simultaneously? Are there trade-offs, that kind of thing? So for this experiment, we had to scale down our grain size. I'll talk a little bit about scaling. We also scaled down our flow rate because it's a much narrower channel. This was a 34 centimeter wide channel as opposed to, I think, a 90 centimeter wide channel for the other case. But essentially, we started with a plain flat bed, applied a sediment supply of 20 grams per minute continuously through this first phase. It took 80 hours to get to what we considered an equilibrium. So we got to that point. And then, I say we, David, my student, then David increased the sediment supply to 40 grams per minute, so we doubled it, and ran it until hour 230, whatever that works out to, 150 more hours of experimental time, until we got to what we felt was close enough to a second equilibrium that we could stop the experiment. So the main focus here is what happened from equilibrium 1 to equilibrium 2, both in terms of the endpoints as well as the temporal progression throughout. Here's my note on scaling for this geometry. So here is our grain size distribution. If we use a scaling factor of 1/50, that would scale up to something like 31 millimeters for sediment, for D50, and our discharge would be approximately 35 cubic meters per second with a width of 17 meters. This is a compilation of gravel bed meandering slope discharge, bankful discharge measurements that Christian Broderick put together as part of his dissertation. And our scaled values fall like within the range, pretty close to his Leopold and Woolman threshold. So we feel like this is reasonable for a gravel bed meandering channel that we're trying to simulate in a scaled down model. Similarly to what we did in the other geometry, this is a structure for motion model of David's flume. So he was adding sediment at the upstream end, initially by hand, but then he developed an Arduino sediment feeder that made it much easier. Our normal sediment feeder was much too big to handle this small of amount of sediment. We didn't use this bucket, but we were collecting sediment at the downstream end every hour. Water surface scan was conducted every half hour here. Again, we're trying to get this temporal progression, so these things are important. At the end of every day, we would collect a structure for motion model of the bed. David was also observing bed forms that developed during the channel. So we have this big book of hand-drawn bed form maps that David was collected throughout. And then at the end of each equilibrium, the only destructive sampling we did was these grease block samplings at different locations in the flume to try to get grain size of the surface. Okay, this is an example structure from motion point cloud that David collected. These data were especially important for this experiment because we tried to use it to get, if not grain size, at least patterns of sorting on the bed, which I'll talk about. So David collected between 500 and 850 photos at the end of each day, and then we would use Metashape to produce these various structure from motion products. And from the topography, you could see different scales of bed forms that would develop during the experiment, which we wanted to separate from one another. So the way that we did that was we took the topography, we detrended the overall slope from it, and then would run a fast Fourier transform to filter out the different scales of variability in that detrended topography so that we could get essentially the bar pool topography with any dunes or grain scale roughness features stripped off. And then the dunes and grain scale roughness features would be their own extracted data set. So if we take this, this data set and add it to this data set, we get this data set, is the idea. So we can sort of do a fast Fourier transform filter in the frequency domain to look at just the bar geometry versus these smaller scale features.
So what's the range? Like, sorry, you said it earlier, but I'm wondering if this range is the same because it's a different grain size distribution, right? But like, you feel like you can get you can see how where the large, or maybe you're about to show us large particles versus short.
Yeah, I will show you probably on this slide, maybe the next one. Yeah, but I'll answer that question in a second. So having done that decomposition of the topography, we then can characterize different aspects of what was happening during the experiment. So if we take the dune section of our topography, David made not a center line, but essentially it's kind of a Thalweg trace profile through the bends in the channel, and then did a similar zero crossing analysis to get dune amplitude and wavelength. And for the bars, we did something similar where we took the bar portion of that separated filtered topography and did a zero crossing analysis to get a bar amplitude. The bar wavelength is set by the geometry of our walls in this case. This is what Kimberly was asking about. So if we look at the high resolution digital elevation model for a portion of the data set that's showing the dunes and the grain scale roughness, this is what it looks like in a hillshade relief. And we can't make out individual grains in this because it is still too fine, but there are sorting patterns that I think you can see where the coarse particles tended to kind of congregate and the fine particles tended to kind of congregate. So what we did to try to characterize that was do a moving average window over that data set to essentially average out any sort of dune topography to just get the grain scale variations, and then run a standard deviation window across that filtered data, and then classify through some threshold, in this case 0.11 millimeters standard deviation, individual pixels in here that we would classify as coarse versus fine. So we didn't get grain size necessarily from this, but we did get the pattern and percent of channel that we might characterize as coarse versus fine versus medium. Okay, this is just, I'll just show this for a second to show the progression of the experiment. So we had our initial phase one, we reached what we thought was essentially an equilibrium, doubled the sediment supply, and kept it going until we felt like we had done enough. And then these are scans of each of those types of topography, the overall detrended, the bar pool, and this extracted bed form topography. And as this movie goes through, you can kind of see, especially with these bed forms, there's different periods where they seem to be more or less active, which is one part of the story with how this channel responded. So we can look at some results for this experiment. This is organized with spatial scale increasing from top to bottom and temporal scale going from left to right. So we have initially the grain scale response. This vertical red line here at 80 hours is the end of that first phase. The second vertical red line is the end of the second phase. And starting with the grain scale, I'll just point out that we didn't see a whole lot of change. Okay, this is the condition at the end of the first phase. This is the condition at the end of the second phase below it. And these pie charts show the distribution of fine, medium, and coarse particles that we extracted from that high-resolution filtered DEM. It's largely similar. There's a slight increase in the fines and a slight decrease in the coarse, but overall, I would argue there's not that big of a change, especially since most of the coarse in this first part was at this downstream reach that we didn't really want to put too much weight on. So not a big grain size response, which I found a little bit surprising. If we look at the cross-section scale, this is the scale at which I'm thinking these bed forms were important. This shows kind of a heat map of the frequency with which dunes were observed. This is going through time from top to bottom and streamwise distance from left to right. And the end of the first phase is this dashed red line. And the important thing that I want to show here is we got to the end of the first phase, we doubled the sediment supply, and then the yellows and greens just kind of go away for a little while, right? The dunes kind of disappeared briefly for, I don't know, 40 hours or something, maybe 20 hours. And then they start to come back. Okay, so we had this temporal response this is the mean dune height where there were quite a few dunes, pretty big ones, and then for about 20 hours, it drops down to something around the size of individual grains here. It was a little surprising, I think, that we found these dunes, but dunes in gravel, if we were to scale this up to a gravel bed channel, it's not necessarily unheard of that we would see these things in nature. This is a figure from a paper that Jeremy Venditti and I and some others put together 10 years ago now, suggesting that gravel dunes happen when you have really high sediment supplies. And this is a photo that Rolf Kellerhals took of some gravel dunes. So it is possible to get dunes in gravel, and that might be what we were seeing here in a scaled sense. But the important thing was that these bed forms sort of fell away for a little while, and then they came back after we doubled the sediment supply. If we look at the mean bar pool amplitude, that's kind of the next larger scale, spatial scale that we might be looking at, we see that the bar pool amplitude also declines, but it declined, in this case, about 10 hours after the minimum of our dune amplitude. Okay, so we initially had a dune response, then we had a bar pool response, but the bar pool amplitude also came back to approximately its pre-sediment supply increase value by the end of the experiment. And then finally, if we look at the reach average slope, it increased dramatically, 44%, going from the end of phase 1 to the end of phase 2. So that was the dominant overall response for this channel geometry. But my argument is that this temporary stalling of that slope increase while the dunes and the bars were adjusting their height is important. In other words, the channel was able to respond by first dealing with this smallest scale dune geometry. That kind of got overwhelmed, so then it moved to reducing the bar pool amplitude. That also became overwhelmed. While it was doing that, the slope stayed constant. And then once those two mechanisms of adjustment had kind of exhausted themselves, then the slope started to increase. So we've got this temporal progression where we've got an increasing spatial scale of response that we're documenting over the course of this experiment after we doubled the sediment supply. So David thought about how can we put this in a framework that might be conceptually useful. And so he took this idea that Eaton and Church had described in a 2004 paper where we have a total alluvial system resistance as some combination of grain scale, bed form, bar pool, and sinuosity or overall reach slope resistance. And the idea is that at the initial equilibrium, we have some system resistance that the system needs to move that amount of sediment and water through. We double the sediment supply. We need to move twice the amount of sediment through, so we have to reduce that overall system resistance through some combination of these different spatial scales of resistance changes that could be done. And so conceptually, in our case, we had this temporal progression where our grain scale response was basically 0. So we didn't have enough heterogeneous sorting, I think, in the first place to see a meaningful change there. Our sediment supply was probably too high, our bed mobility was probably too high. But we did see this temporal progression of cross-sectional sort of dune scale response, meander scale response associated with bar pool amplitude, and then ultimately a reach scale response associated with an overall increase in the reach average bed slope. So we had this temporary pause in that slope increase while these more intermediate spatial scales were changing. But then once those had sort of reached their limit, the channel had no real choice but to increase its overall slope. All right, so summary for this experiment, slope increase is the dominant response, but these transient responses for the dune and the bar pool response. It followed a spatial and temporal progression in response to doubling the sediment supply. And so there's likely, figures like this can potentially, change depending upon what type of channel you're looking at. We had fixed walls for this, so having the ability to widen and migrate definitely would add kind of another scale and another circle to this. But we were limited in our capability to look at that particular phenomenon for these experiments. And I think this is my last slide. So there are some implications here that I'd just like to think about at the end as we close. First is that the sedimentological regime is important. I think this comes out from our variable width channel results, where we see that the topographic heterogeneity associated with unsteady flow and reducing that heterogeneity with a sediment supply increase is an important mechanism for river beds to respond to disturbance. Riffle pool maintenance appears to depend more on pool scouring during high flows and less on riffle building. This is relevant to riffle pool maintenance questions and potentially habitat management. The dependence of bar pool relief on discharge suggests that a variable hydrologic regime is important for perpetuating ecologically important morphological features. And finally, from David's work in the meandering channel, there's a range of scales that channels can use to adapt to changes in sediment supply and changing discharge. And they may be transient if supply is not a primary control. So I think that's it. Yes. So I'll take any questions. Thanks for your attention.
And I'll run the microphone around, but I am going to take liberty and maybe ask you the first question, if that's okay. I was curious about you said that there wasn't much of a grain size response, but I saw when you plotted, I don't know if you can go back to where you were plotting in particular the D10, D50, D85 for the two wider channels, essentially the riffle pool and then the straight channel. You had that.
So not this one.
No,
but the other ones.
earlier, but I could ask a similar question, but I'm gonna hold myself back for now, ask you later. But so if I look at the feed exiting that you're monitoring, it to me, and then I guess I have a little bit of a question about that. Is this all surface measurements? Is this from your structure from motion measurements that you're getting this? And then, or is it at depth? And then second, can you say something about that increased kind of spuriousness, especially in the second part, but in the pool riffle sequence for the D84? It seems like the D84 is suddenly really noisy.
Yeah, so these grain size measurements are for the stuff that was coming out the downstream end. So it's the transport material as opposed to the surface.
Oh, so you're sorting what's coming out as a function of time? Is that how you get that information? So how do you get the D84 versus D50 versus D60?
Yeah, so we collect the samples and then sieve them and get the distribution. So that's what that represents.
Okay.
Yeah, and it didn't change too much. There was this increase in D84 at whatever that time was.
I would say it's
not sure
increasing
why.
up and down. Okay. We can talk about that maybe.
Okay.
Okay, thanks a lot. Now I will be a faithful servant of the people. Questions? Otherwise, I'm going to ask more. Do we have any questions on the Zoom? Okay. Oh, Chris, is that okay?
Yeah.
Sorry? No Zoom yet. Thank you.
So I have an elementary question here. Why do you think filling in the topography, let's say for either the meander case or the pool case, increases the sediment transport capacity?
Yeah.
Seems to me there's an argument you could make either way for that. So what do you think the mechanics is?
Okay. Yeah. So what I think is going on is, so if we take like this variable width channel where we had these bumpy central bars and we had deep sections on the side and they came up to a big part in the middle, and then we have this relatively large riffle pool relief. If you think about that on like a reach average basis, that's a lot of kind of macro scale roughness that the flow has to accommodate, and it's extracting momentum from the flow, which otherwise it could use to move sediment transport. And then as those topographic variabilities fill in, it gets smoother. So we go from something that's quite bumpy to something that's somewhat less bumpy. That macro scale roughness has a smaller amplitude or a smaller overall roughness length scale, like we could call it. And so we have the same amount of flow moving through, but it's got less overall macro roughness, and so more of that energy is available to transport the sediment. So that's my thinking. But you said you had an argument the other way too. So I'm curious what that is.
Oh, we'll talk about it later.
Okay.
I don't want to make the argument.
Thanks for a great talk, Peter. I'm going to ask a question kind of following up on Chris's. I'm really curious about the riffle pool sequence as a way of channel adjustment that's not adjusting slope, but rather adjusting roughness. And I was curious, because I don't know as much about these, if this is a way that channels will adjust when sediment supply is relatively low, and perhaps why that becomes more advantageous if it's correct, instead of changing the channel slope.
So are you asking like if, I guess I'm trying to think about like what the natural system might look like here. So if you have a relatively low channel, relatively low system that has maybe downstream variations in width that have led to the development of riffles and pools, are you asking like, do you need to have a high sediment supply for this to be important, or is there a threshold, or?
Yeah, I guess what I'm imagining is that there's a system with, and I often see riffles and pools in upland and mountain channels, so thinking potentially lower sediment supply, smaller drainage area, and potentially having the slope of the rivers be tied in some ways to the bedrock slope underneath.
Right.
And just wondering if, because you see this very small variation in slope, this big change in roughness that then allows you to pulse more sediment through or less, whether this is adjusted either to periodic perturbations, where it's actually quite flexibly able to accommodate different sediment loads, or whether this is a way, if the overall slope has to stay steep because it's not incising into bedrock, that the river can self-adjust to increase roughness and therefore keep an alluvial bed.
Okay, I think I get it. So I think one thing here that we didn't see that we could have if we had a lower sediment supply is we might have seen more of a surface grain size change. In this case, I think our sediment supply, even for this initial case, was high enough that we had a relatively unarmored bed. And so even if we had downstream variations in width that led to riffles and pools, we still might have seen really coarse riffles and relatively fine pools, where then if we increase that sediment supply, perhaps before the pools start to fill in, we see the riffles get finer or something like that. So it's kind of this idea in that third phase that I was talking about, where the first change that might happen is the one that requires, say, the least amount of change in mass or volume of sediment, which would be a grain size adjustment. And then once that, that level of adjustment has kind of been maxed out, then you start to get to that next scale. So I suspect, you know, we didn't have the right conditions to look at that here, but in these mountain channels where you have lower sediment supply, they're still steep. You can't really change the slope too much, but they're relatively low sediment supply. You might have at least a transient grain size response before you start to see some of this other stuff happening. But yeah, I could see it going, you know, in one direction, then unraveling the other way if you reduce the sediment supply.
Thank you.
Sorry, one more question. I missed maybe the beginning of the talk in the sense of what is your rationale for doubling the sediment feed while keeping the water discharge constant?
Yeah, the rationale for keeping the water the same but doubling the sediment feed was mainly we wanted to try and not make things more complicated than we could. So it's essentially like it was motivated largely by this Elwha River data that I showed as an introduction to that second experiment where there's essentially a run-of-the-river dam. They take the dam out, the hydrology doesn't change, but you've got all this additional sediment moving through the system. So that was kind of the motivation for this. It doesn't account for systems where you have increases in sediment supply associated with increases in discharge that you might for like storm event hydrographs or something like that. It's kind of a different type of system, but that was the motivation for the work, and that's what we went with, and it happened to make the experiments a little bit more straightforward.
This is the reality that as a physical correspondence in a living condition.
What?
It's not clear it's equilibrium, right?
But it's
Just
looking at
motivated.
the living condition.
Yeah, would you say that there's a real, so the question, maybe you should repeat it.
Yeah.
Yeah, is whether there is a correspondence in a physical system where something like this happens.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the Elwha was kind of the motivation. So there might be other disturbances that could lead to increased sediment supply, at least temporarily. You know, if we have like a debris flow that dumps a bunch of sediment into the channel, it's not affecting maybe long-term hydrology, but we suddenly have a lot of sediment that's entered the system and it has to go somewhere. Like these are things that happen in urbanized environments, that happen in post-fire environments, that happen in dam removal environments where the hydrology doesn't change too much, but the sediment input. Yeah, and I didn't talk about those here, but we have done other experiments where we've added like a pulse of sediment and seen how does that pulse evolve in the downstream direction. And it gets more complicated, but it's not too different.
So this will be the last question, and then Peter's around a little bit later.
Yeah, I'm around, so okay, go ahead.
Thank you, cool talk. So I think you probably mentioned this and I missed it, but at any given time, especially in those later two where you were seeing pools and riffles a lot, not like evolving over time, but at any given time, did you see a big grain size difference between the pools and riffles, or were they roughly similar in composition?
Not as much. That was one of the things that we really thought we were going to see going in, but it turns out that our experimental design in terms of the grain size distribution that we chose, the slope and the discharge, it just led to, I'd say, too active of sediment transport conditions that it was like an unarmored surface. So we didn't see much segregation.
So even like in the pools and whatnot, you had a ton of sediment all moving, pretty actively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there were some so like in this experiment, the straight channel experiment with the width variations, I would say occasionally we would scour down to a point where the pools did have some armoring present, but it was kind of like a transient phenomenon. So it's, yeah. I think we just chose too high of an initial sediment feed or something, yeah.
Really interesting work. I'm sure a lot of us have a lot more questions. So, so thanks a lot. Let's thank our speaker again. Thank you, Peter.